Thanks everyone for joining. Natalie, are we expecting some more people?
No, we can probably start now.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this STING webinar series on data safety and monitoring boards. Before we start, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So my name is Sabine Braat and I will be facilitating this webinar. This is an online webinar, obviously. So some housekeeping rules. There's a chat function where you can ask some questions and the speakers would prefer to have the questions at the end. The recording will be made available after the webinar. You probably already know the importance of having statisticians being trained in the role of a DSMB and the role of a DSMB in monitoring the safety of a clinical trial. So this DSMB webinar series is in that spirit of extending the training for DSMB members. This is the third webinar of the series. We had one in September, one in October. This is the third one, which will be extending the presentations that were provided earlier with a focus on Bayesian or adaptive trials. So we have two excellent speakers today. We have Tom, who's a clinical scientist, Director of Health and Clinical Analytics in the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney. And he's also an infectious disease physician in the Sydney Children's Hospital Network. We also have Julie Marsh, Biostatistical Lead in the Adaptive Health Intelligence Team at the Westpharma Centers of Vaccines and Infectious Diseases at the Kids Research Institute, and Adjunct Associate Professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Western Australia. Combined, Tom and Julie represent decades of experience in clinical trials and adaptive trials, and I look very much forward to their presentation. I will now hand over to both either Julie or Tom to start the presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep, lovely. Okay. So yeah, no, thank you, Sabine. Thank you to STING for the invitation to present. So as Sabine said, both Julie and I have experience with designing adaptive trials, and we also have experience sitting on data safety monitoring boards. So we wanted to present our experience and I guess our opinions about the role of DSMBs specifically for adaptive trials. We very much work in designing Bayesian trials, so this will be very much with that flavour, although a lot of the points we make I think will be applicable to frequentist adaptive designs as well. So I'm going to start by just describing exactly what it is we mean by an adaptive trial and I guess what we don't mean by an adaptive trial, why people might want to use adaptations or plan adaptations and arguments for not adapting. Talk about various rules for adaptation and how those rules are determined. Julie will then talk about specific governance and information flow considerations for adaptive trials. We'll talk about the evolving role of DSMBs in providing oversight of adaptive trials, trying to complement the previous two seminars by Professor Thabane. And then Julie will talk about how what we've said agrees or doesn't with the evolving guidelines, and we'll discuss the foundations for DSMBs. So I know many of you will know a lot about adaptive trials already, but for the benefit of those who are not sure exactly what we're talking about, essentially an adaptive trial is any trial that implements planned changes or adaptations to features of the design based on interim analyses of accrued data according to pre-specified rules. And the important words here are planned. So we're talking about adaptations or modifications that are planned in advance of the trial, not ad hoc as the trial is evolving. And that it's according to rules that are pre-specified. So we're talking about having everything planned and documented in advance of the trial, not as the trial is evolving. What are the various things that people adapt? The most common thing is the number of enrolments into a trial. So this is trying to enroll just as many participants in a trial as is needed to satisfactorily answer the question, and not more and not fewer. People often will try to adapt or change the interventions that are under study according to pre-specified rules. Sometimes people will want to adapt the probability of assignment of to each intervention that's under study in the trial, and sometimes people will want to adapt or modify the population that's under study. And we'll talk about the motivations for each of those types of adaptations. It's important to talk about the things that really shouldn't be adapted. So this is really moving the goalposts. The intention with adaptations is not to move the goalposts, keep the goalposts where they are, but improve the chance of achieving the goals rather than changing them. And so we wouldn't normally want to or try to adapt the aims and the objectives of the trial. They should remain the same. And likewise, we shouldn't be trying to adapt the criteria or the thresholds for drawing conclusions from the evidence, for example, thresholds for declaring superiority or non-inferiority. And we shouldn't be changing over time the rules for making the adaptations. That while we change the features of the design, those features are changed according to rules that are pre-specified before the trial commences as much as possible. So why would someone want to adapt? Starting from the worst reason for wanting to adapt, we're often approached by people who want to do an adaptive trial because they think this will increase their chance of funding success. That raises red flags for us. That's the worst reason in the world for wanting to implement adaptations in a trial. Other reasons, people believe that an adaptive trial will improve their power or the efficiency or the speed of their trial, or the speed of progression through phases of trials. And certainly in some circumstances, this can be important. For example, in the context of a pandemic, there's good rationale for wanting to be as quick as possible. But perhaps more importantly, adaptations, one important motivation is that we believe it could improve the likelihood of answering the research questions that we have and answering them correctly. And it can do this despite uncertainty before the trial in a range of things, including the frequency or the distribution of the outcome, the size of the treatment effect, or the comparative treatment effects, heterogeneity of the treatment effects across different patient subgroups, and uncertainty about which intervention or form of intervention is most promising. So all of these things in a traditional trial are threats to the ability to answer the question, and the idea of adaptations is that it can help to manage that uncertainty and do it by protecting the trial operating characteristics. So by this we mean increasing the power and or the precision of the effect estimates while maintaining low and acceptable type 1 error for conclusions, low bias in the effect estimates, and maintaining a feasible sample size, time for the trial and cost of enrolment. So all of these things need to be balanced, and also doing it while achieving an acceptable burden and level of risk for participants. Another motivation for implementing planned adaptations is to try to avoid and reduce the need for unplanned trial modifications. So unfortunately, unplanned trial modifications are a fact of life. They happen in most of the trials that we're involved in, but they're not good for scientific validity, and we want to try to avoid them as much as possible. And another perhaps neglected motivation for adaptation is to try to minimise the burden or risk of harm for participants compared to the benefit that they might obtain from participating in a trial. So they're all the reasons why we might want to adapt in a clinical trial. What are the reasons for not adapting in a trial? An important one is that typically the planning that needs to go into planning adaptations delays the commencement of the trial. Adaptive trials are unfamiliar, both for those investigators who are implementing them and people who are interpreting the results from the trial, and all else considered, we should be preferring things that are familiar. It adds complexity, and again, all else being equal, we should be trying to avoid unnecessary complexity. It's hard doing and designing and implementing adaptive trials. Certainly makes the implementation and the design harder. Importantly, because of the complexity, it increases the risk of errors, both errors in the design and errors in the implementation. And not only does it increase the risk of making mistakes, making errors, but it can do that in ways that are hard to anticipate the impact of. So that's all just to say that we should never be implementing adaptations just for the sake of innovation, just for the sake of adaptations. Any adaptation needs to be properly justified and carefully planned and carefully implemented. So what are the types of adaptations we typically see? Rules around stopping, pre-specified rules for stopping are the most common. As I said, they need to be pre-specified and they need to be justified. They're usually applied to the primary efficacy analysis. So it's usually around evidence of efficacy of a treatment. Sometimes, although not often, there may be stopping rules applied to safety outcomes, but generally only when those safety outcomes can be anticipated in advance. We typically see stopping rules implemented for expected success. So this is where, after an analysis of accumulating data, there's a very high probability that a treatment and an intervention is superior to control or non-inferior, depending on what the goals of the trial are. Alternatively, sometimes the success rules are around not the probability of an intervention being superior based on the data that we have, but on high prediction of success after all the participants who are on the trial complete their follow-up. So sometimes in these interim analyses, there are still people who have data that's still to be collected. They've already been enrolled, and so we're predicting what the outcome will be once they complete their follow-up. When you stop for success, you have to think about who benefits from stopping early for success. Usually the sponsor or the investigators will benefit from stopping early for success. Sometimes participants will benefit from stopping early for success, especially if they then have access to the beneficial treatment. But really the public benefits from stopping early. Usually it's in the public or science's interest to gain as much information as possible about a treatment. So stopping early is not always in the broader interest of the community. The other types of stopping are often for futility. So this is where, after an analysis of the data, it's assessed that there's a low probability that an intervention or a treatment is superior or non-inferior to the control, or where there is a low predicted probability that even if you enroll to some maximum sample size, maximum enrollment, low probability that you will be able to declare superiority at the end of the trial. Again, who benefits from stopping early for futility? Usually the sponsor will benefit or the investigators, because they will not be investing effort and money into a trial that will ultimately prove futile. Sometimes the participant will benefit if that means they're no longer exposed to a treatment that's unlikely to be effective and may be harmful. But again, rarely is the public's interest served by stopping early for futility. Generally, it's in the public interest to collect as much evidence as possible about the effectiveness or comparative effectiveness of alternative treatments. In terms of other adaptation rules, there are often rules around dropping arms. So this is where you have a multi-arm trial, typically, where the trial can continue, but if you have a particular arm or intervention that is clearly not going to be better than the control, or is clearly not going to be the best arm, you want to drop that arm for futility so that you can focus your enrolment on arms that are looking more promising. Sometimes people want to drop patient subgroups, pre-specified subgroups, due to a low probability of a particular treatment being effective for them, or being the best treatment option if it's a multi-arm trial. Sometimes people want to be able to add new arms, especially if some arms are being dropped over time, so that they can more fully explore the range of potentially beneficial interventions. And then the other rules that we often see are rules around changing the ratio of assignment to the alternative interventions or treatments that are under study. And generally this is so that you will assign more people or more future participants to any arms that are looking the most promising, and fewer participants to any arms that are not looking as promising, and eventually with the expectation that if an arm is looking futile, that will be dropped. How are these rules determined? It's important to point out that typically rules for more complex adaptive trials are bespoke for each trial. So we heard in some of the previous seminars some heuristics around when you might want to or not want to stop for success based on the number of events that have been captured as a proportion of the total expected, or heuristic, and there are also other heuristics around when you may or may not want to adapt based on the period of enrolment compared to the length of follow-up. Sometimes those heuristics are helpful, but more typically apply very specific rules specific for each trial that balances the operating characteristics for competing goals and objectives. And what that means is that if you have a complex trial, especially like a platform trial, which has multiple objectives, it becomes more and more complicated and more difficult to achieve good operating characteristics for achieving each of those goals and objectives. And in order to do that, for these more complex designs, the only way you can do that is really through simulation. And the simulations that we and others do typically look across a range of assumed scenarios, a range of assumed truths around sample sizes, event rates, treatment effects, including assuming no treatment effects, and also around heterogeneity of treatment effects across different subgroups, and also looking and exploring a range of alternative rules for stopping or implementing other adaptations. And possibly those scenarios might also explore alternative endpoints and alternative statistical models. So you end up with a very complex and multi-dimensional series of simulations. And it's important to point out that even seemingly simple rules can have complex effects that are hard to anticipate. And really the only way to do this is to do these multifactorial, multi-dimensional simulations. And it's important when you do that, that any complex adaptive rules should always be assessed in reference to some simpler benchmark design. This serves as our sanity check. How much better is our complex design in terms of the operating characteristics compared to a benchmark design, which might be a simple fixed sample size, non-adaptive trial? And so to what extent are the rules for adaptation that we're implementing likely to help achieve the desired operating characteristics versus hinder them? So I will now hand over to Julie to talk about governance and information flow.
So in our adaptive trials, there are subtle differences in the governance structure. So moving from the left here, you'll be familiar with the trial management group, that's the day-to-day delivery, the trial steering committee, which is the executive decision-making group, and you have the data safety and monitoring board. What differs is there has to be a blinded and unblinded group dealing with the design of the trial. So the simulations are performed and updated by a blinded group who are unaware of what the ongoing results are from the interim analysis. And there's an analytic team who are informed by the statistical subcommittee or the design team of exactly what the model is, when the interims are performed. Statistical analysis plans are all produced by a blinded group, but executed by an unblinded group. So as you can imagine, the firewalls are really important under this situation. Next. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of managing the information flow. So and the need for that firewall to maintain the trial in integrity. So the adaptive trials involve the frequent interim analysis, which increases both the volume and the complexity of data reviewed by the DSMB. Careful planning is needed to ensure investigators remain blinded to avoid operational bias. And timing and format of the reports must be standardized to support transparent decision making. So this requires not only tight control over the data pipeline, which includes timely, clean data extraction and predefined statistical outputs, but the decisions also need to be justifiable and traceable. So you need good documentation practices. We bound this all up and control this firewall for the information flow with use of charters, the DSMC charter, the terms of reference for those different governance groups, and you could also write them into any standard operating procedures. So if you're interested in describing who sees what, when, and how, and reducing the risk of information leakage. So on this design, on this here, you see the operational committees feeding into where the data is. There's also the treatment assignment. You see the data, the information flows into the analytics team, but under my right-hand side here, you have the control of the interim results. And the flow back into the trial steering committee is only via the DSMB. So that with the recommendations that are passed on, and the DSMC here are the guardians of that flow of information to ensure that nothing leaks back into the trial steering committee. And this is all documented in these terms of reference. Next, back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Julie. I'm going to talk a little bit more now about the specific role of the DSMB in adaptive trials. And the first point here, I borrow from Roger Lewis talking about the hierarchy of responsibilities of the DSMB. So the first duty or responsibility of the DSMB is to participants in the trial. It always has to be the number one responsibility, that they need to be protected against unacceptable burden and unacceptable risk of harm. Obviously, any trial is going to pose burden and some risk of harm to participants, but it has to be acceptable. And the DSMB is there to make sure that throughout the trial that is always the case. The second responsibility of the DSMB is the duty to the public, and that is served by protecting the science, protecting against biased estimates, protecting against false conclusions, and also, where possible, resolving uncertainty. And then the third responsibility, and the least important, is the duty to the sponsor or the investigators. The duty to try to protect investigators against futile effort and futile costs with respect to whatever their goals are. It's important to note that the interests of participants, the broader public, and the sponsor or the investigators don't always align, and this is really the challenge of the DSMB, is to balance these interests, which are often competing, and to be clear about the hierarchy of responsibility. Not only that, for each trial decision, for each adaptation, whether it's planned or unplanned, has an effect on these competing interests, and always need to be thinking about whose interest does this adaptation or change serve and who does it not serve, and how do I balance those competing interests. So there are things that, as someone who is going on to a DSMB for an adaptive trial, there's something that you can do in order to try to fulfill your duties to these various interests. As I said, duty to the investigator or the sponsor is probably the lowest priority, but in order to fulfill that responsibility, you need to understand what the goals of the sponsor and the investigators are. What are the intended consequences of the trial? And we normally think of this in terms of what decision or action do we anticipate or do we intend the trial to inform? Is it just a scientific publication, or are we looking to influence recommendations? Are we looking to inform licensure decisions? Or if a drug or a treatment is already available, are we trying to influence the uptake of that drug or the treatment? And if so, in whom, for what indication, for what target group? Or is the trial really looking to inform decisions around further development of this treatment, or to inform how future trials or future development of this treatment should be implemented? For example, selecting the ideal or optimal dose or strategy of implementing the intervention. It's important also, as a member of the DSMB, to understand not only the goals but also the constraints that are on the sponsor or the investigator team. Typically, for the trials that we're involved in, the major constraints are around funding, the amount of funding that's available, the time frame. People are generally working within fixed time frames, but there may also be regulatory and other constraints. And it's important for members of the DSMB to fulfil their duties, if any, to the sponsor, to understand those things. With regards to fulfilling responsibilities or duties to the broader public through good science, the things that a member of the DSMB should do before the trial is, and this is true for any trial, is make sure that they understand what the scientific questions are, understand what the proposed design is, understand what the pre-trial assumptions were, and assess whether those assumptions were likely to be reasonable. And before proceeding with the trial, understand or convince oneself that the scientific value of the trial, the public value, outweighs the burden and the potential risk to participants in the trial. More specifically, for adaptive trials, it's important to understand what the investigators' desired operating characteristics for the trial are. To what extent are they wanting to minimise type 1 versus type 2 error? To what extent are they wanting to minimise bias versus variance? What's the maximum or acceptable number of participants? What's the maximum or acceptable budget and timeframes? Are those things reasonable? It's important to understand what the proposed adaptation rules are and to understand how those adaptation rules will help the trial to achieve those desired target operating characteristics. How do they compare to a simple benchmark design trial? It's important to understand what were the range of plausible scenarios and range of possible decision rules that were factored into the simulation. How robust is the proposed design with the proposed decision rules to departures from the assumptions? And then finally, in terms of fulfilling one's duty to participants, as for any trial, you need to know what is already known about the potential risks of the studied interventions. What is the investigator's plan for evaluating those risks over the course of the trial? How and when safety events will be ascertained and reported but importantly, also how will efficacy be reported, and when will it be reported? Because assessments of safety almost always need to also consider and be balanced against evidence of efficacy. So almost always need to be looking at safety and efficacy at the same time, even if we're not drawing conclusions around efficacy. And more specifically, for an adaptive trial, are there stopping rules for harm? And if not, why not? In some of the trials that we're involved in, the harms are actually quite predictable. Harms of predictable toxicity for drugs that are either well-known or are in a class of drugs like chemotherapy, where actually the toxicity and the harms are quite predictable. And so if the DSMB is needing to make assessments of potential stopping for harm, are we actually going to furnish them with explicit rules, or are we going to just expect them to use their own judgment? And if we're expecting them just to use their own judgment for stopping, then why is it? And the typical reason for not giving them specific stopping rules is that some harms are not anticipated. But for harms that are anticipated, need to consider whether there should actually be explicit rules rather than just expecting the DSMB to apply their own rules. You need also to know when and how often the DSMB is planned to meet, and what information they will have, and how much time will the DSMB have between receiving the data, the DSMB report, and the meeting. Because for these complex trials, digesting all of this information is a lot of work, and people need to be given sufficient time to be able to review the materials. So that's the things that the DSMB members should do before the trial starts. Now I'm going to discuss some of the typical problems that DSMBs encounter after the trial starts. And some of these are non-specific and they occur in all trials. Some of them are more likely to occur in an adaptive trial. I guess the most common issue that DSMBs encounter and trial groups encounter are problems with enrolment, especially enrolment that is slow, where there's a risk because of time constraints that the trial will fail to reach its target, and therefore it'll have low power with regards to the research questions. Often that then throws up a desire from investigators to change the protocol in ways to facilitate enrolment. For example, broadening eligibility criteria, possibly extending the duration of the trial, and you need to consider what impact that might have on the target operating characteristics. Occasionally, enrolment is faster than anticipated. And for most trials, this is not a problem. This is a good thing, makes the power likely to achieve its target sample size and gives it good power. But for an adaptive trial, this can have unanticipated consequences for the operating characteristics. Sometimes it can mean that the planned adaptations in the trial are no longer effective because actually most of the participants have been already enrolled before you've had an opportunity to apply planned adaptations. So you need to think about what the consequences of fast enrolment might have for a particular trial. Another frequent issue that arises is with regards to the frequency of the endpoint or the size of the treatment effect. Typically, the endpoint or the outcome is less frequent than anticipated. sometimes the observed effect is smaller than the investigators were optimistically hoping for, and that has an effect on power. And again, often in order to try to increase the likelihood of still having a usable and useful result from the trial, there are all sorts of things that people try in that context. Sometimes just expanding the sample size. Sometimes, depending on the endpoint, following up for longer, and each of those decisions can have impacts on the operating characteristic of the trial that need to be fully understood before they're implemented. Another thing we sometimes see is heterogeneity in treatment effects across different patient subgroups. And one particular issue for adaptive trials is sometimes the effectiveness of an intervention can change over time because of change in the population enrolled. And so one example that is being brought up by Roger Lewis is the situation where you initially enroll people who are relatively treatment refractory and in high need. And as a result of that, treatment is looking futile, but over time you are enrolling incident cases of the disease at an earlier stage, which is potentially more amenable to the intervention. And so there's a risk you could stop for futility for a treatment that, if you had continued, might ultimately be proven to be effective. And then there's a frequent problem of apparent subgroup specific effects where the effect of the treatment looks as though it may be occurring in a particular patient subgroup, but not in others, and often there's a desire to target particular subgroups, but you run a real risk of just chasing noise in the data and consequences from that for errors. Other common issues, too much data that's missing, too much dropout. But another problem that sometimes we encounter is the trial runs out of time, runs out of money, but sometimes it runs out of interest by the investigators. Sometimes investigators put responsibility or try to put responsibility on DSMBs to make decisions in those situations. So in addition to those problems that often are encountered during a trial, there are certain problems that can be caused by the DSMB or by the investigators as the trial occurs. For example, unplanned stopping for high efficacy, as we heard in the previous lectures by Professor Pavane, that can inflate the risk of a type 1 error, especially if it's done early in the trial. It can also inflate bias or in particular overestimation of effect sizes. If it's planned, then we can assess what the size of the overestimation is likely to be. But if it's unplanned, it's very difficult to know how much bias, how much type 1 error inflation we are implementing. Can also, stopping early, reduce our certainty about the size of the treatment effect, and can also reduce our certainty about the effects on secondary endpoints and effects on safety. And stopping early can have unanticipated impact on other trial objectives. Conversely, failing to stop when you have a stopping rule for futility can also have consequences. It can lead itself to inflation of type 1 error. Sometimes the futility rule is a mechanism for controlling type 1 error. And if you don't stop when you plan to stop, that can have consequences for type 1 area that need to be understood. It can also obviously pose an unacceptable burden and risk to participants if the trial truly is futile and the benefit of continuing is outweighed by the burden on participants. So key points, adaptations should always, or as far as possible, be pre-specified, and they always need to be justified in terms of the expected burden, risk versus benefit to participants, expected effect on scientific integrity, protection against the known unknowns, and finally, in terms of expected efficiency, speed, and cost. By the same token, any deviation from planned adaptations can also do more harm than good. And they should be avoided and only done if they are justified in terms of burden and risk to participants versus benefit, scientific integrity, that is protection against the unknown unknowns. What are the things that have emerged during the trial that weren't anticipated before the trial? And rarely should they be justified in terms of efficiency, speed, and costs alone. I hand back to you, Julie.
Thanks, Tom. So now we've tried to produce some checklists that you can easily run through. And these current slides are taken in from the perspective of the DSMB members. So the first part is the earlier engagement in the timeline. So you have the timeline across the top here, starting before the first patient is enrolled. You do have a little bit of flexibility. You can almost take it up to the first data transfer, but that's really pushing the limit here. And this early engagement is all around understanding the trial intent. We often say, oh yeah, we'll look at the safety in a DSMB, but I think it's important to explicitly state whether it's a secondary outcome or whether you're talking about the adverse events or just the serious and adverse event reporting. And in addition to that, how will it be reported out? Are you breaking it down by different interventions? What happens if, like in a platform study, if they're receiving a series of, in parallel receiving different interventions? Do you only report out those attributed to one or the other, or report them all out for all of them? So there's these types of nitty-gritty details that need to be sorted out. It's important to acknowledge the increased volume and complexity of data reviewed by the DSMB compared to traditional trials. And platform trials, in addition to that, will also answer multiple research questions. So how much segregation do you want in these reports across those issues? Platform trials may also include multiple sub-studies. You'll need to discuss upfront whether the DSMC is expected to have oversight over those sub-studies or whether that will be external to the DSMC charter. There are also registry components that you may have in these trials, which are observational data, and they may or may not be reported. Generally, they're not reported to the DSMB. So the important part at this stage is explicitly stating things in terms of the safety and the efficacy outcomes that will be reported in the closed report. So that's blinded, that's only available to the analytic team and to the DSMB. Also explicitly state the expectations on quality of data. In particular, missedness is always a big issue here. And there are additional considerations if your primary outcome, for example, is a lab-based assay and you're waiting for that to be batched up to be available, building significant delays between when the data becomes available, when the sample's taken, when all the samples can be batched up, when all the transportation occurs, finding the time in the lab to turn it around and sending it back to the analytic team. So there's significant delays. You could add easily up to 3 months to an interim from when the last sample is available if it's laboratory based. Most importantly is understanding the trial simulations. You really need to get down into those weeds and understand all the nitty gritty and importantly the assumptions underlying those and all the different scenarios that were undertaken. The statistical model is far more complex. So there is that aspect. Come prepared to ask questions to the analytic team in that setup stage and really grasp how it would be presented to you, particularly if you're unfamiliar with Bayesian methods. I really recommend you start doing foundation courses in those now, just to understand the basics. When there are decision rules, it is plausible that the way they're designed, multiple rules could flag up within the same interim, in which case it's best to have them ranked up front. So would you consider futility above superiority or superiority above futility? And that can occur in the early interims if from simulations they're not calibrated sufficiently or the right scenarios were not considered. So that really gets into the realm of what are the unknowns as well. Most of this can be addressed by agreeing the content of the open and closed report format, and actually having an example DSMC meeting using simulated data prior to that first data transfer would really help the understanding for both parties. So next. So this is the part we usually concentrate on. The DSMB is turning up for the regular interim analysis. And the first thing that occurs here is there is a focus on the efficacy data, because DSMCs are used to monitoring the safety, and all of a sudden they're getting to see a peak view of all of the efficacy. It's really important to hold your horses and remember that it's based on risk, so it's the benefit and the harm at this point in time. In advance of that meeting, you need to allow significant time to go through those reports. And we're talking about reports that can run into 30, 40, 50, sometimes 100 pages. So it really is a significant amount of advanced time you have to set apart, at least 2 to 3, maybe for some trials up to 4 hours in preparation of each of those meetings. There's also the consideration of the safety definitions may vary for different treatments, because if you're answering different research questions, you may anticipate much higher rates of, for example, kidney injury in one domain, but you wouldn't anticipate it in a different domain. So there may be different thresholds and considerations for safety based on the different research questions being addressed in a platform trial. It all goes back to, so rather than just analysing risk, there's also bias. So from those adaptations that are performed, or the missing data, or loss to follow-up, I think the DSMBs members are far more involved in the assessment of bias and maintaining the trial integrity than they are in traditional trials. So there is that focus on trial adherence and deviations. Next. Okay. Sorry, I'm just whipping for my notes. The importance in the efficacy side of it and the decision rules is the rigid adherence to those decision rules. And think of them as rules, not guidelines. For example, high or lower accrual rates can affect trial operating characteristics, especially if they're based on predictive posterior distribution. So as Tom mentioned previously in his slides, it's something as simple as recruitment rates can weigh in on the trial operating procedures here. And note that decision criteria, once they've been met and the trial adaptation has been implemented, for example, an arm dropped, they don't need to be included in future reports. Indeed, if you include those decision criteria, you may find that they fluctuate slightly above and below that threshold for a while. So there is a time epoch which is available on all of these, most of these platform trials. And so you should also look at the effect of the efficacy over time. When I talk about the efficacy, there's the unmodeled or the unadjusted rate. So if you look at raw proportions in the different time periods as a trial progresses, you can see whether that has been maintained. So it moves to that sources of bias. And as Tom mentioned earlier, you may accrue different patients at different points in the trial's history. So really the main point here is around avoiding that drift and providing blinded feedback of those recommendations to the trial steering committee. Next. I am aware we are ticking up to the end of it. So the guidelines have things to say about this as well. So the ICH E6R3 raises the bar on data governance and risk-based oversight, whereas the ICH E20, which are currently in draft form, requires the pre-specified adaptation rules and simulation-based operating characteristics. However, the FDA guidance and EMA materials reinforce expectations for the independence of the Data Safety Monitoring Board and the documentation and proportional monitoring in these complex adaptive trials. Next. Recent literature highlights additional needs, often based around Bayesian or statistical expertise. The new governance structures were required, and the transparency in the decision logs and integration of safety within the decision framework. I won't mention the references, sorry, but this is built heavily on the DSMB mini-series 2022 from the New England Journal of Medicine, and also in the interim recordings and publications by Don and Scott Berry and Roger Lewis, and also DSMBs for real-world clinical trials from Bunning et al. In 2023. Next. But just to round off at the end, how can the investigators support DSMBs in this adapting trial framework? Pre-specify and simulate everything. Okay? Look for exemplars on DSMC charters for adaptive trials. There are additional considerations in terms of communications and firewalls, and concentrate on that information flow and the risk balanced against the bias. There is an increased risk of bias creeping in, I think, from these adaptive trials compared to traditional designs. That can be overcome by maintaining rigorous data governance and audit trails. And the future designs will likely incorporate safety thresholds as well. But importantly, remember, document every decision and every rationale. You may need those to support publications or regulatory submissions. Thank you.
Thanks,
Yes.
Sabine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julie and Tom. I'm very conscious that we're at 1 o'clock. This presentation was very comprehensive and very insightful, and I definitely recognize some of the challenges that were presented in terms of recruitment or running out of funding. There is one question in the chat from Peter, and I wonder whether we could still have a look at that before we close off the webinar. So Peter had a question on the role of the DSMB in stopping for harm in absence of a defined stopping rule. Is it reasonable to adjust threshold for early stopping on the basis of emerging evidence of efficacy? I wonder whether either Tom or Julie, you might have some ideas around that.
Yeah, so if I understand Peter's question, the decisions around stopping for harm should always be taken in the context of evidence of efficacy. So that those things should always be considered together. So if you've got a drug that has toxicity and the data suggests little chance of being effective, that's a different situation from a drug that is clearly very effective or has evidence of being effective but has toxicity. So I think usually we talk about needing to consider those things together And sometimes those competing considerations can be factored into a decision rule that takes into account both efficacy and toxicity or harm. That is an appealing way of doing it. I think the way that is more commonly done, though, is that they're kept separate, and it's left to the DSMB to use their judgment about how to balance likelihood of efficacy versus harm. But yes, in theory, they should always be judged together, and there may be some ways to do that formally.
Thank you so much, Tom. I think I'll leave it with that. Thank you again, Julie and Tom, for this presentation. This was the last one in the 3-part webinar series. As all of the webinar is recorded, so you can look at it again, and it will be distributed among all of the people who have registered. If you can, please take a minute to complete the post-webinar feedback survey. It's there in the chat with a link. And before I close off, just mentioning that the ACTA Symposium is on middle of November, and we hope to see many of you at the symposium. So thank you all for joining, and have a good rest of your day.